Hello everyone, and welcome to this glorious sunny afternoon after a record low temperature last night of -7 in Canberra. Chapter 3 of Paddington Takes the Air is called Riding High. Paddington reined in his horse and stared at the judge's rostrum as if he could hardly believe his ears. "I've got 452 faults," he exclaimed hotly, "but I've only been round once." "There are 12 fences," said Guy Cheetham, measuring his words with care, "and you went straight through all of them. That's 48 for a start, plus another 4 for going back over the last one. And," he added, bringing the subject firmly to a close as he glared down at the battered remains of what had once been a hat, "your horse trampled all over my best bowler, the one I intended wearing at the presentation this afternoon. That's another 400. Mr. Cheeseman wasn't in the best of moods. In fact, the look on his face as he made an entry alongside Paddington's signature on the clipboard he was carrying was what Mrs. Bird would have called a study. He gave the distinct impression that he wished he'd never heard of St. Christopher's School and its teachers and parents in general, not to mention Paddington in particular. The occasion was the end-of-term celebrations at Judy's school, and instead of the usual speech-making, Miss Grimshaw, the headmistress, had decided to hold a gymkhana in aid of a new swimming pool. There were a number of events on the programme, and the two main items at the beginning and end were open to all and sundry, including the parents, relations, and friends of the pupils. The competitors were given sponsor sheets, and each had to collect as many signatures as possible from people who were prepared to pay a small sum for every successful jump. The Browns arrived quite early in the day, and Paddington, who had decided to enter for both the events, had been kept very busy hurrying around the grounds collecting names for his sheet. He was already a familiar figure at Judy's school, and almost the entire upper and lower 4th, 5th and 6th forms had persuaded their nearest and dearest to sponsor him at anything between 50 pence and £1 a jump. In view of the number of signatures Paddington had managed to collect, the swimming pool fund stood to benefit by a tidy amount. Guy Cheeseman, the famous Olympic rider, had very kindly agreed to judge the contests and act as commentator, and with the sun shining down from a cloudless sky, the sound of horses' hooves pounding the turf, the murmur of the large crowd which had gathered round the sports field, and the creaking of innumerable picnic baskets, it promised to be a memorable occasion. The roar of excitement as Paddington mounted his horse was equalled only by the groan of disappointment which went up as he disappeared from view over the other side, and when he eventually reappeared facing the wrong way, an ominous silence fell over the field, a silence broken only by the crash of falling fences and a cry of rage from Mr. Cheeseman as he watched his best hat being ground to a pulp. Paddington was much more upset than anyone, for although he'd never actually been on a horse before, let alone a jumping one, Mr. Gruber had lent him several very good books on the subject, and he'd spent the last few evenings sitting astride a poof in the Browns' sitting room, practicing with a homemade whip and some stirrups made from a pair of Jonathan's old handcuffs. It was almost disappointing. In fact, he rather wished now he'd chosen something else to practice on. To start with, the horse was very much taller and harder than he'd expected, more iron and steel than flesh and blood, and whereas by gripping the poof between his knees he'd been able to hop around the house at quite a speed, it was nothing compared with Black Beauty once she got going. That is part, aside from when he'd unexpectedly bumped into Mrs. Bird in the hall, he'd never attempted any kind of jumps on the poofs. And no matter what he shouted to Black Beauty, she seemed to have it firmly fixed in her mind that the shortest distance between 2 points was a straight line, regardless of what happened to be in the way. According to Mr. Gruber's book, one of the first requirements in horse riding was complete confidence between rider and mount, and Paddington would have been the first to admit that as far as he was concerned, he was a non-starter in this respect. He completed the round, clinging helplessly to Black Beauty's tail, with his eyes tightly closed, and the trail of damage they left behind made the hockey pitch at St. Christopher's resemble the fields of Belgium immediately after the Battle of Waterloo. "Never mind, Paddington," said Judy, grabbing hold of the reins. "We all thought you did jolly well, especially as it was your first time out," she added amid a chorus of sympathetic agreements from the other girls. "Not many people would have dared to try." Thank you very, very much," stuttered Paddington. He was still feeling as if he'd been for a ride on a particularly powerful pneumatic drill, and he gave Mr. Cheeseman a very hard stare indeed as he was helped down to the ground. "It's a shame, really," said Mrs. Brown, as they watched his progress back to the horse enclosure. "It would have made such a nice start to the day if he'd had a clear round." "Perhaps he'll do better in the Chase Me Charlie," said Jonathan hopefully. "He's down for that as well at the end." 452 faults indeed," snorted Mrs. Bird as the commentator's voice boomed through the loudspeakers. "It's a good job he didn't tread on Paddington's hat. He'd have lost a good deal more than that." Giving a final glare in the direction of the judge's rostrum, the Browns' housekeeper began busying herself with the picnic basket in a way which boded ill for Mr. Cheeseman's chances of a snack if he found he'd left his own sandwiches at home. "That's a good idea," said Jonathan enthusiastically. "I'm so hungry I could eat a horse." "Pity you didn't eat Paddington," said Mr. Brown gloomily, "especially after the last round." "Shh, Henry," whispered Mrs. Brown. "Here he comes. We don't want to upset him any more." Mr. Brown hastily turned his attention to the important matter of lunch, and as the fences were put back and the next event got under way, he began setting up a table and chair in the shade of a nearby oak tree. Mr. Brown didn't believe in doing things by halves, especially when picnics were concerned, and he shared the French habit of turning such affairs into a full-scale family occasion. Mrs. Bird had packed an enormous hamper of jars and plastic containers brimful with sliced tomatoes, cucumber, beetroot, ham, beef, liver sausage, and seemingly endless supplies of mixed salads. What with these and strawberries and cream to follow, not to mention 2 sorts of ice cream, lemonade, tea, coffee, various cakes and sweetmeats, and a jar of Paddington's favourite marmalade into the bargain, the table was soon groaning under the weight. Even Mr. Brown, who wasn't normally too keen on equestrian events, had to admit that he couldn't think of a more pleasant way of spending a summer afternoon. And as event followed event and the contents of the hamper grew less and less, the bad start to the day was soon forgotten. Paddington himself had worked up quite an appetite, though for once he seemed more interested in Mr. Gruber's book on riding, which he'd brought with him in case of emergency, rather than the actual food itself. Several times he dipped his paw into the bowl of salad dressing in mistake for the marmalade, as he studied a particularly interesting chapter on jumping, which he hadn't read before. And apart from suddenly rearing up into the air once or twice as he went through the motions, he remained remarkably quiet. It wasn't until nearly the end of the meal, when he absent-mindedly reached into the basket and helped himself to one of Mrs. Bird's meringues, that he showed any signs of life at all. "Aren't they delicious?" said Mrs. Brown. "I don't think I've ever tasted better." "Don't you like them, Paddington?" asked Mrs. Bird, looking most concerned at the expression on his face. Yes, Mrs. Bird," said Paddington politely. They're very unusual. I think I'll put some marmalade on to take the taste." Paddington's voice trailed away. Although not wishing to say he didn't think much of Mrs. Bird's meringues at all, and he was glad it was particularly small and dainty, it was really most unusual, for Mrs. Bird was an extremely good cook, and her cakes normally melted in the mouth, whereas the present one not only showed no signs of melting, but was positively stringy. And it wasn't just the texture. Paddington couldn't make up his mind if it was because he'd followed the ice cream with another helping of Russian salad, or whether Mr. Brown had accidentally spilled some paraffin over it when he'd filled the picnic stove. But whatever the reason, Mrs. Bird's meringue was very odd indeed, and not even a liberal splodge of marmalade entirely took the taste away. However, Paddington was a polite bear, and he had no wish to offend anyone, least of all Mrs. Bird, so he dutifully carried on. Fortunately, he was saved any further embarrassment by Guy Cheeseman announcing that the final event on the programme was about to take place and asking the competitors to come forward. Hastily cramming the remains of the meringue into his mouth, Paddington gathered up his book and sponsor sheet and hurried off in the direction of the saddling enclosure, closely followed by Judy and several of her friends. "I know one thing," said Mr. Brown as he disappeared from view into the crowd. "If he manages to get over one fence, the swimming pool fund won't do too badly. He's got enough signatures now to float a battleship." For various reasons, Paddington's sponsor sheet had grown considerably during the course of the afternoon. Apart from a number of people who'd added their names a second time to show they hadn't lost faith, there was a considerable new element who had signed for quite a different reason, sensing that in backing Paddington they could show willing without too much an expense, and his sheet was now jam-packed with signatures. "It would serve some of them right if he did do well," said Mrs. Bird darkly. "It might teach them a lesson." Mrs. Bird looked as if she was about to add a great deal more, but at that moment a burst of applause heralded the first of the long line of competitors. The Chase Me Charlie event was one in which all the contestants formed up in a circle, their horses nose to tail, and took it in turns to jump a single pole. Only one fault was allowed, and each time a round had been completed, those with faults dropped out, and the pole was raised another inch until the final winner emerged. Practically everyone who could ride was taking part, and the circle of horses stretched right round the field, so that it was some time before Paddington came into view on Black Beauty. There was a nasty moment when he came past the Browns and tried to raise his hat, which he'd insisted on wearing on top of his compulsory riding one. But he soon righted himself and disappeared from view again, holding the reins with one paw and anxiously consulting Mr. Gruber's book, which he still held in the other. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown nervously, "I do hope he takes care. I didn't like to say so in his presence, but it must be terribly difficult with short legs. No wonder his paws keep coming out of the stirrups." "I shouldn't worry," said Mrs. Bird. "There's one thing about bears, they always fall on their feet, no matter what happens." Mrs. Bird did her best to sound cheerful, but she looked as worried as anyone as they waited for Paddington to make his first jump. Judy arrived back just in the nick of time, and in the excitement, only Mrs. Bird's sharp eyes noticed that she, too, was now wearing a very odd expression on her face, an expression, moreover, which was almost identical to the one Paddington had worn a little earlier when he'd had trouble with his meringue. But before she had time to look into the matter, her attention was drawn back to the field as a great roar went up from the crowd. The Browns watched in amazement as Paddington and Black Beauty literally sailed over the pole. One moment they'd been trotting gently towards it, then Paddington appeared to lean forward and whisper something in the horse's ear. The very next instant, horse and rider leapt into the air and cleared the hurdle with several feet to spare. Admittedly, the pole was at its lowest mark, but even so, the performance drew a gasp of astonishment from the onlookers. "Bravo!" cried someone near the Browns. "That bear's done it at last, and not even a sign of a refusal." "Heavens above!" exclaimed Mr. Brown, twirling his moustache with excitement. "If he carries on like that, he'll be up there among the leaders in no time. Did you see it? He went higher than anyone." Jonathan listened to his sister as she whispered in his ear. "If he does it again," he said gloomily. "Well, even if he doesn't, he's certainly not bottom this time," said Mrs. Brown thankfully, as a following rider brought the pole down with a clatter. And as it happened, Jonathan's worst fears went unrealized, for seeming miracle began to follow miracle, as Paddington and Black Beauty made one effortless clear round after another, and one by one the other competitors began to drop out. Each time they drew near to the jump, Paddington leaned over and appeared to whisper something in Black Beauty's ear, and each time it had a magical effect as she bounded into action and, with a whinny which echoed round the cloisters, cleared the hurdle with feet to spare. Paddington was so excited he discarded Mr. Gruber's book in order to raise his hat in acknowledgement of the cheers, and even those who'd signed his sheet rather late in the day, although they'd worn long faces at first, began applauding with the rest. And when it came to the final round, with Paddington pitted against Diana Ridgway, the head girl, the excitement was intense. Even with loyalties so divided, the cheer which rang out as Paddington emerged the victor practically shook the school to its foundations, and Diana Ridgway herself set the seal on the occasion by dismounting and running over to offer her congratulations. Guy Cheeseman so far forgot the unpleasantness early in the day that phrases like superb horsemanship, splendid display, and supreme example of rider and mount being as one floated round the grounds with scarcely a pause for breath. For some reason or other, Diana Ridgway appeared to have second thoughts as Paddington leaned down to speak to her, but with an obvious effort she overcame them, and in the general excitement the moment passed practically unnoticed. "What an incredible business!" exclaimed Mr. Brown, mopping his brow as he settled down again. "I wonder what on earth Paddington kept whispering to Black Beauty. It must have been something pretty good to make her want to jump like that." Jonathan and Judy exchanged glances. Then Judy took a deep breath. "I'm not sure he whispered anything," she began, only to break off again as she suddenly caught sight of Paddington and the headmistress about to converge a short distance away. "Crikey, that's torn it," said Jonathan, as Miss Grimshaw began pumping Paddington's paw up and down. "Stout effort," she cried. "Allow me to shake you by the paw. You've given our swimming pool a tremendous fillip." Paddington began to look more and more surprised as he listened to the headmistress. He had no idea they'd dug the hole even, let alone filled it up. "I hope I haven't filled it up too full, Miss Grimshaw," he exclaimed politely. Miss Grimshaw's smile seemed to have become strangely fixed. Then she paused and gave a sniff. "I really must get Birchwood to look into the drains," she added, eyeing Paddington even more doubtfully. I hope we shall meet again at the presentation." "Crumbs," said Judy as the headmistress hurried on her way. "The presentation. We'd better do something before then." Dashing over to Paddington, she grabbed hold of his paw and then turned to her brother. "Come on, Jonathan," she called. "We'll take him to see Matron. She's just over there in the first aid tent. She may be able to give him something." "Matron?" echoed Mrs. Brown as Judy began whispering in Paddington's ear. "What on earth are they on about?" "It's all right, Mrs. Brown," cried Paddington. "It's nothing serious. I'm afraid I'm having some trouble with one of Mrs. Bird's meringues." "Trouble with one of my meringues?" Mrs. Bird began to look thoughtful as Judy and Jonathan whisked Paddington away. "How many did the children have?" she asked, rummaging in her picnic basket. "3 each, I think," replied Mrs. Brown. "I remember them talking about it. Jonathan wanted another one, but there weren't any left. I had 2, the same as you." She turned to her husband. "How many did you have, Henry?" 4, said Mr. Brown. "They were a bit moreish." "That makes 14 altogether," said Mrs. Bird as she began emptying the contents of the picnic basket. "And that's all I made," she added ominously. "So whatever the bear ate, it certainly wasn't a meringue." Mr. Brown wound down the window of his car to its fullest extent and then glanced across at Paddington. "How anyone could mistake a head of garlic for a meringue, I just don't know," he said. "Especially one of Mrs. Bird's," said Judy. "Matron couldn't believe her ears." "Or her nose," exclaimed Jonathan. Paddington looked at them sheepishly. "I'm afraid I was busy reading about my cavalites," he explained. "That's to do with jumping. I didn't notice. I'd made a mistake until it was too late." "But a whole head," said Mrs. Brown from behind her handkerchief. "I mean, a clove would have been bad enough, but a whole head. No wonder Black Beauty was jumping so well," said Judy. "Every time you leaned over her, she must have got the full force. It's a wonder she didn't go into orbit," agreed Jonathan. The Browns were making all possible speed in the direction of Windsor Gardens, but even with all the windows open, there was a decided air about the car. Paddington had been standing on the front seat with his head poking out of the sunroof for most of the way, and every time they stopped they got some very funny looks indeed from any passer-by who happened to be downwind. "I'll say one thing," remarked Mr. Brown as they drew to a halt alongside a policeman who hastily waved them on again. "It soon clears the traffic. I don't think we've ever made better time." "Perhaps I could eat some garlic when we go out again, Mr. Brown," said Paddington, anxious to make amends. Mr. Brown gave a shudder. "No, thank you," he said. "Once is quite enough." "Anyway," broke in Judy, "all's well that ends well. There were over 200 signatures on Paddington's sheet, and Miss Grimshaw reckons it must be worth at least as many pounds to the fund." "Mr. Cheeseman said he'd never seen anything like it before," said Jonathan. "Nor will he again if I have anything to do with it," said Mrs. Bird grimly. "That's the last time I make any meringues." In the chorus of dismay which greeted this last remark, Paddington's voice was loudest of all. "Perhaps you could make them extra large, Mrs. Bird," he said hopefully. "Then they won't get mistaken." The Browns' housekeeper remained silent for a moment. All in all, despite everything, it had been a most enjoyable day, and she was the last person to want to spoil it. "Perhaps you're right," she said, relenting at last, "but you must promise not to go riding on the poof when we get home." Paddington didn't take too long to make up his mind. Although he was much too polite to say so, the events of the day were beginning to catch up on him, and sitting down even on the softest of poofs was the last thing he had in mind. "I think," he announced amid general laughter as he clambered up on the seat again, "I shall go to sleep standing up tonight."